Welcome everyone. In this video, I'm going to walk us through the strategies that make up what we call active reading. So in our class, what we're going to need to practice is active reading as opposed to passive reading. Passive reading is something that we're very familiar with. It comes second nature to us. But active reading is something that we don't do on a day-to-day basis, and therefore we need to practice it in order to gain more from the things that we read, not only in our class, but in college in general. Active reading is very, very important. So let's get started with this here. So active reading is different from passive reading. Now, passive reading we do all the time. We do on a day-to-day basis, and we do it without thinking. It's second nature to us. And passive reading, it doesn't require much from us. We don't need to do much in order for it to happen. We do it all the time. So when we're reading news articles, for example, or we're looking up a Wikipedia page for something that we're trying to learn more about, or just have a question about, perhaps we're trying to learn about certain scores or some sort of current event. Maybe we're looking at recipes or instructions to set up something, or perhaps an explanation of some sort of simple concept or idea. All of that is passive reading. We do that on a day-to-day basis, and we can do this without much focus, and we can do it in heavily distracted environments. So we could do it when there's loud music playing, we can do it when the TV's on, we can do it when we're on the bus, crowded bus, or, in a crowded environment and there's a lot of chaos going on. We can still get the information we need if we're reading passively. We're typically skimming through things and it doesn't require much from us. Active reading, though, we don't do it on a day-to-day basis typically, especially if maybe we're new to college, or perhaps took some time off from college, or maybe you're just getting started with college, right? This is something that we need to be able to develop, and in order to develop, we need to practice, right? We need to do it on a day-to-day basis. So active reading, as I mentioned, if we are not immersed in our educations or we're not used to doing it, it's probably not very common in our daily life. And as I mentioned, therefore, we need to practice it. Just with any skill that maybe we don't do on a day-to-day basis, we might need to practice it when we come back to it. And what the use for active reading, we read actively when we're trying to gain a deeper understanding of a complex or dense reading. So something like an essay, or perhaps a long article with a lot of unfamiliar terminology or concepts. Books, so whether that's a nonfiction book or a work of fiction, novels, poetry, even plays, or music, television shows, sometimes we might read actively if we're kind of thinking of it in a more metaphorical sense. But when we're thinking about a traditional text, something with print words, it pertains to works that are a little bit longer usually. They require more focus and attention in order for it to be done successfully. And usually it can't be done in a distracted environment, or at least can't be done very well. I know we all have, or most of us probably think we're pretty good at being able to multitask. Multitasking is actually a myth. It doesn't really exist. It's just some excuse we tell ourselves as humans. But really, in order to glean information and deeper understanding from dense, complex ideas and texts, we need to be able to reduce distractions and to really give them our full focus and attention. So when we're reading actively, some things that I want us to do in order to set ourselves up for success. So you're going to hear me use this phrase a lot this semester. Set yourself up for success. Now, if we're setting ourselves up for success when we're reading actively, these are the things that we want to do in order to create the conditions for success to occur. If we don't create the conditions for success to occur, then how can we expect success to arrive if we haven't created those conditions, right? So, when we're reading actively, when we're reading complex, dense texts, like what we'll be reading from Habits of the Creative Mind and some other things that we might read for this class, we need to make sure that we are reducing distractions. So one of the biggest distractors is that damn device that I call a distraction device. In other words, our cell phone. So I think it is a really, really smart idea to not only silence your phone, but to hide it, to put it somewhere where you cannot see it. You know, preferably you put it in another room so you keep it away from you. Usually if we have the phone out on the desk, even if it's silent, it is still distracting us because we'll pick it up every couple of seconds, every 30 seconds we'll check it again. Oh, did I get any messages? Oh, let me look at this. Oh. But when we put it away, we're less likely to do that. Something else, obviously, if we got the TV on, we got music going, we got, people talking to us, all these other things going on, that could be very distracting, and it's going to make it incredibly hard for us to focus on a dense, complex reading like we'll be doing this semester. So it's really important that you reduce your distractions around you. So electronic devices, music, people, all of those things. Clearing your desk, making sure that your space is, orderly, so you're not going to be kind of fidgeting with things. Something else to help set ourselves up for success is to be mindful of our body language. Body language does a lot for our focus. If you're reclining in bed or lounging on your couch, laying down on the floor, slouching, all of these things send messages to our brain. If we're laying down, it's going to send the message to our brain that it's time to relax, time to chill out, and therefore we might get tired and sleepy. That's why many of us might find it hard for us to stay awake when we're reading. It might be because we're kind of lounging and telling our bodies, or using our bodies to tell our minds that we're trying to relax. So what you want to do is sit up as best as you can. It's better to sit at a table or a desk so that you have a nice surface to write on. Studies show that the best way to sit up in a chair is to envision that you have a tail growing out of your tailbone, like a dog tail. Picture the biggest, bushiest dog tail that you can, like a big golden retriever tail. So imagine that you have a tail growing out of your tailbone. You want to sit in such a way where you're not sitting on your imaginary tail. And so when you do that, if you kind of think about it, your spine is going to be in better alignment, and it's going to send that signal to your mind that it's time to focus. And so that's where body language really comes into play here. Something else, another material thing that you'll need to help set yourself up for success is you'll need to have a pen or a pencil in your hand, or at least ready to go by your side, so that you can underline ideas as you come to them. You can jot down notes in your notebook or in the margin of your book, whatever the case might be. You want to have a pen or pencil, as opposed to a highlighter. At least not only a highlighter, because you can't really write notes down with a highlighter. So you want to have at least a pen or a pencil in addition to a highlighter if you do like to highlight things. Sometimes we might get a little highlighter crazy and we highlight the entire page and we're like, dang, I don't know what ideas were standing out to me because everything's highlighted. So you want to be a little bit more discerning in that. But a pen or a pencil is better, so you can circle and write and underline and do those things. And then you want to make sure that you have a notebook available and open. So this is particularly important if you're using a digital version of the text where you can't necessarily annotate in the book itself. So you want to make sure that you have a notebook open by your side, ready to go, so that you can jot down questions that you might have about what you're reading. You can jot down connections to other ideas or texts that you've encountered, things that relate to what you're reading, jotting down any explanations of concepts, or perhaps writing down definitions to words or vocabulary that perhaps you don't understand. Anything that you might need to jot down in order to help you gain more from the text, you want to have that notebook available. So these are all the things to do to help set yourself up for success when we're reading actively. Now, what we want to do when we are actually reading, so you've set yourself up for success, you've reduced your distractions, you're sitting up straight, got your notebook, your pen, everything's ready to go. Now you are reading the text, and these are the things that you want to do while you're reading. So the first thing, obviously, you want to pay attention to sentences or ideas that stand out to you as interesting, surprising, important, or even confusing, especially if something is confusing. So if something stands out to you as interesting, like, oh wow, that's a really interesting idea, go ahead and make a note of it. If something surprises you, like, oh wow, I've never thought of that before, or oh my gosh, I never understood that, oh wow. If it surprises you, make a note of that. If something strikes you as important, perhaps the author is maybe making an important assertion about an idea, or maybe defining a key term. You want to make note of those things. And then if something is confusing to you, don't shy away from the confusing things. It's human nature to not want to be confused or to feel uncomfortable, right? We don't like that as human beings. And so it's natural to kind of avoid those types of things. But we need to train ourselves to embrace confusion. We want to go toward the things that confuse us, because when we do, ultimately we're more likely to learn from that, because we're trying to understand it, right? That's where learning occurs. We want to jot down questions that we might have about the things that we're reading. So whether that's in the margin of your book or in your notebook, you want to explain connections to other texts or ideas. So maybe as you're reading, there's an idea that reminds you of something else that you've encountered elsewhere. Make that connection clear, because that might be important to you later on when you're dealing with that text, perhaps in an essay, right? You want to make sure that you're clear of those connections, or you're explaining those connections. You might want to jot down helpful explanations of certain ideas or concepts. And in some cases, some of you might be more visual learners. It might be appropriate to create little diagrams that could perhaps help explain certain ideas. As you're going along, you also want to make note of unfamiliar vocabulary or references to unfamiliar people, events, and or concepts. So if you encounter a word that you don't understand, which is probably very likely, I encounter words I don't understand all the time. But rather than just skimming over and say, I don't understand what that word means, oh well. No, go ahead and make a note of that, and perhaps either define it right there, or say that you need to come back to it to define it later so that you actually understand what it means, right? We all have access to the internet. You can look up words on the internet. Excellent tool to help you gain more from what you're reading. So don't just skim over things if you don't understand and say, oh well, too bad, I'll never understand that. No, take some initiative, actually look it up. Try your best to see if you can make better sense of that. Same is true if perhaps you're reading something and they reference a person that you've never heard of before. You're like, oh, who the heck's that person? What? I don't understand why they're bringing that up. That could help you better understand these ideas. Same with events that might have occurred that maybe you don't know about or you're unaware of. Concepts, those types of things that you're just unfamiliar with. It's a really good idea to make notes of those things so that you can actually look them up later, is usually how I recommend it. That way you're not constantly being pulled out of the text. But it might be the case where you need to look something up before you continue in order to understand it better. Something else that you'll want to do is to keep track of important quotations and the page numbers for those quotations. So as you're reading, if there's a statement or idea that the author mentions that you think is going to be useful for you in a future writing exercise or writing project, for example, keep track of that quotation and the page number for that quotation, so that when you come back to it, in a few days or a few weeks even, you are able to find that quotation, right? You're like, oh yeah, I jotted it down, it's on page 86, cool. I like to keep track of them in a Google Doc, so I'll just go ahead and create a Google Doc for something that I might be reading, and I'll just type in all the quotations that stand out to me, and I'll make note of those page numbers, so I don't need to try to track them down, retrace my steps. I just say, oh yeah, that quotation was on this page, cool. And you can go turn to that page. And then finally, just overall, just be curious about what you're reading. I think this brings all of these things together. Be curious about what you encounter. Ask questions about the things that you read. If you don't understand something, like I said, don't just throw up your hands and say, oh, I don't understand it. Oh, well. No, be curious. Say, why don't I understand that? Let me see if I can figure this out. Curiosity is a habit of mind that Miller and Jurecic will talk quite a bit about in Habits of the Creative Mind, and we want to practice that. So be curious. Be curious. Take some initiative over your learning. Now, finally, this overall reading actively and annotating, that's an investment in your future. If you read something now and you annotate it as you're going along, you're making notes, you're jotting down questions, you're defining key terms, you're circling things you don't understand, doing all those different things now, when you come back to it in the future, maybe in a day or two, maybe in a week or two, in some cases it might be a month or two, or even depending on the project or what it is, it might even be next year, 2 years from now, depending. All of that is an investment in your future if you do it now, because then you can go back to those annotations and you remind yourself of the ideas that stood out to you. And you don't need to read the whole thing from start to finish in order to remember what goes on in there. You're investing in your future. You're putting in that legwork now to make it easier on yourself in the future. And this is going to be particularly important with Habits of the Creative Mind, because in some way or other, all of our essays are connected to Habits of the Creative Mind, but some of our essays will deal explicitly with ideas in the readings, and we need to make sure that we are keeping track of that throughout the semester, rather than kind of skimming through and then needing to go back and read it again and read it again and read it again, right? So these annotations are a way to invest in your future. So set yourself up for success, read actively, invest in your future. All right, y'all, happy reading.